Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section we're going to look at bubble charts, and bubble charts are another way of dealing with three variables. In the example that I'm going to use here, these aren't actually three independent variables because the third variable is actually a function of the other two. And what we do in a bubble chart is, in what was the z-axis in the surface chart in another section, we now represent not by a vertical axis, but by the size of the symbol that represents the third variable. Now, in order to demonstrate bubble charts, what I'm going to use is this data. This is 2015 data, and it relates to the population of some of the major countries in the world and their GDP per person, and also the implication of these figures in terms of that country's overall GDP. So first, what I'm going to do is plot the population against GDP using a regular scatter chart. So let's select our data, go to Insert, and we're going to insert a scatter chart. Let's just make that a little bit smaller so we can see. And there it is, you can see the plot. Note that the points at this stage are not labelled, but the GDP per person, which is in US dollars, is on a scale of up to $60,000 per person on the left, and the populations are plotted horizontally. That's the y-axis. Now, you probably won't be surprised to see that there isn't some straightforward linear relationship between GDP and population. In fact, it seems quite random. But we can add to the information provided by this chart by adding the information in the third column. And that is that given the 6 countries' GDP and population figures, what is the implication in each case for the overall GDP of the country? Which countries have the biggest overall GDP? Is it the ones with the highest GDP per person or the ones with the highest population? I think if you had to have a guess at it, you would say it's probably both, but it would be much more helpful if you could get an overall representation of the GDP on the chart as well. And that's one of the things a bubble chart does for us. So what I'm going to do now is draw a bubble chart, and I'm going to include the third column of information, and the values in the third column will be represented by the size of each bubble. Now, in a way, of course, this is a very easy thing to do, but you do need to be a little bit careful when you are creating a bubble chart, and I'm going to do this one wrong to start off with. So I've deleted my scatter chart, and let me select the 3 columns of data, including the headers. And we go to Insert and Bubble Chart. And there is my bubble chart, but it's actually wrong. The vertical values, the GDP per person values, are fine, and the size of the bubbles actually are representing the overall national GDP for each of those 6 countries. But the horizontal axis, rather than showing the population, is just showing the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's basically taking the population figures as a sequence of numbers. Now, the way to get it to draw the bubble chart correctly is that when you're drawing it, do not select the headers. So let's delete this out and try that again. So this time I'm going to make my selection, but I'm going to exclude those headers. I'm going to go to Insert and select my bubble chart again. So now I have the GDP figures correct, the population figures correct, and I have the overall national GDP represented correctly by the size of the bubbles. Now, of course, when building this, I haven't included the header row from the data. If I want to put axis labels on, I'll need to put those in. You might also have noticed that the column B labels, the names of the countries, are not included against each bubble. Now, there isn't a straightforward automatic way of doing that, so if I want to label the bubbles as well, there is a sort of semi-automatic way of doing that I'm going to show you in just a moment. Now, once again, I tend to use bubble charts in presentation situations, so sometimes it's nice to make them look pretty smart, and there are various different chart styles of bubble charts, such as this one. Note also there are various different kinds of bubble charts to choose from. So if we go back to change chart type, you'll see there is a 3D bubble chart there as well, which can look really impressive. And of course you can format the axis. One of the things that you may well want to do is label those individual points, and there are a couple of ways of doing it. If I were to click on that bubble and then right click and select Add Data Labels and Add Data Callouts, you notice the callouts there have some default content, and the default content they have is the 3 values which are from our data selection from each of the countries. What I can do instead is if I right click on that and say Format Data Labels, and you will see the label option on the right, X value, Y value, and bubble size. Let me turn off X and Y value. And what I'm going to have instead is use value from cells. So I need to select the data label range. Well, the labels I want to use are in cells B3 to B8, and click on OK. And I'm going to switch off bubble size as well. And that just leaves the country names in there. And of course, they could be formatted as well if you wanted to. Also notice how Brazil overlaps with Russia. Well, I can sort that out, and I can just grab it and move it around if I want to. So that's bubble charts. I will see you in the next section.